want to share with others. So the record light just came on, so it's official now. So welcome to the neighborhood chat. We're just really excited to have you here. Our first conversation. I'm Dr. Rahsaan Harris. I'm the new-ish CEO of Citizens Committee for New York City. Started on March 16th, and so interestingly, if you don't know our history, we founded in 1970 time, and just kind of as a bit of leadership right now, so we can go back to our roots. And we have multiple pandemics that are going on, as you know. We just live to our mission, which is to make sure that New Yorkers can come together, and we particularly want to make sure that the most vulnerable have an opportunity to come together to improve their neighborhoods in a way that they see fit, in a way that they have voice, in a way that helps them be honored. And we believe that New York City, when you aggregate all of the block level responses and all of the great activities that are happening in each neighborhood, that it makes the city better. And we are really excited that beyond just our grants that we give out, that hopefully we're connecting you to one another, so that there's a community of support, there is capital in you being socially connected, and hopefully that you'll have a seat at the table as New York City is reimagined post pandemics, post COVID, post social injustice, post just trying to figure out what the modern and the future New York City is going to be. So we're really excited. A little bit of context. So some of you have known us for a while, and we have been your friendly neighborhood grantor that helps your block association do a great cleanup, or helps your community garden get the tools and the plants that it needs to flourish. But we wanted to also let you know we've always been doing things that are beyond that. We've helped after school programs, we've helped artists, we've helped formerly incarcerated people reintegrate into community. We've helped immigrants who've been undocumented find ways to find safe spaces and to find their voice. And we're really leaning into our larger mission to make sure that we help leaders wherever they are. And so we've been happy that since March, we've made over $500,000 in grants to what we called all-in neighborhood grants. So they went to leaders and allowed them to identify projects in this moment of COVID and how they were best addressing them. And we wanted to support their leadership to take care of those problems, support their neighbors, and to advance the well-being, whether it be emotional, whether it be physical, or whether it be spiritual. And we've also been able to make almost $500,000 grants to neighborhood businesses that are the economic engines that are driving what's happening in community. We've made approximately $400,000 of commitments, and we'll make the last $100,000 of commitments before the end of the year. So we're just really excited about you being a part of our community. We're excited about you applying for our neighborhood business grants, because they're still out there. There's still a chance for you to be a part of it. And we're excited for you to be on this journey with us as we are there for New York City. So for our first conversation, I'm excited, and I knew that it would not be appropriate if we didn't officially acknowledge Hispanic Heritage Month before it was over. So we mentioned it before, but we wanted to have someone from the Latinx community who is a leader, who has been her authentic self wherever she showed up, to speak to us about how being yourself, standing in your truth, and being who you are can give you strength to be a great leader in times of crisis and can show the way forward. So we're really excited to have Dianne Morales, who's going to be in conversation with us. Just to set the stage, we're going to be in conversation, for at least 20 to 25, 30 minutes, but want to leave at least 10 minutes of questions. So feel free, as I said earlier, to hit us in the chat, and Katie will give you a chance to enter into the conversation. And I asked Dianne to reflect on 3 areas of her life, just to give you guys the sketch: her personal life, her professional life, and how she thinks of herself as a person of purpose to do positive things to change society. And so we're excited for this opportunity. And Dianne, thank you for this time.
Thank you so much for having me, Rahsaan. It's really, really great to be here, and it's wonderful to have the chance to be in community with all of you and to meet everybody. I was actually, mentioning to Rahsaan before we got started, I think how special it is actually that he is deliberately creating this community and creating this space for leaders to come together and have these important conversations. I think that running an organization or being part of an organization can sometimes be very isolating and a very lonely thing, particularly during these times. And so the idea of deliberately creating and structuring and having space to come together and build community, I think is very special. And I am deeply appreciative of it as an outsider, but certainly even as someone who participate and share in this with you today. So thank you.
Well, this is a pleasure because you're such a passionate person and you're willing to put yourself out there. So I think you're a great role model for all of our neighborhood level leaders that are putting themselves out there. I think we learn so much from talking to each other. So let's talk about your origin story. Who are you? Where are you?
Yeah.
¿Dónde estás?
Right, estoy aquí. So I'm a first generation. I'm the youngest of 3, born to Ana and Alfredo Morales, who each came here from La Isla del Encanto on their own. They met here, but they both came here, as many sort of immigrants do, with the sort of idea of pursuing the American dream, and they met here, and I think for them the manifestation of that was that if their daughters worked hard and did well in school, that we would have access to a better life, right, than they did, and they would be able to, just sort of take care of a family. I bought into that hook, line, and sinker at the beginning, right? I did really well in school. I actually was kind of a geek. I loved studying. I loved school. I loved reading. I was one of those kids that would like disappear and go into the world of reading. And
really quickly, where did you go to school? Just to give some shout outs to where you were.
So I grew up in Bed-Stuy. I should say that. Born and raised in Bed-Stuy. I started off at the local public school, but I went. I did 5 years in a parochial school, and back in the day, a lot of Latino and immigrant families sent their kids to the local parochial school. It was sort of like the way, the path. But I was the youngest of 3, but almost by a generation, 7 and 9 years between me and the older. So I was a little bit more rebellious, a little bit more, because I'd kind of seen them do stuff, and I was like, I don't want to do that, or So in the 5th grade, I had this white guy teacher. He was from Texas. He used to wear dashikis. And he used to play the guitar, and that experience was crazy. But he said to my parents, oh, there's this school for gifted students of color in East New York that I think she should go to. And they were like, nope, because the other 2 went to this school. And my mother talks about the moment that we were having this conversation. I didn't know anything about the school he was recommending for me, but it just sounded good, right? And so I said to my mother, well, why do I have to do what they did just because they did it? And she talks about that moment as being the moment where she was just like, oh boy, like this one's going to be tough, meaning me, right? Because I was challenging things that like the other 2 had not challenged. So I ended up going to this gifted school for students of color. We had kids from all over, from like Queens were coming, from Brooklyn. It was 3 classrooms. It was like Little House on the Prairie. It was 1 6th grade, 1 7th grade, 1 8th grade. But we had community, and it was all students of color. So the thing that experience did for me that I think is formative because we had some whip smart kids in that classroom. And so what that experience did for me is to dispel any kind of, or counter any notion that we could not be brilliant.
That's so important to dispel that narrative.
Yeah,
You're rapists, you're criminals. Like, no,
yep,
our people are
yep,
so much more. And you don't, obviously you don't know me because
yeah,
you acting
yeah,
like we
yeah.
aren't all the wonderful things of this world.
Exactly. And what was really cool about that, you know, in retrospect, wasn't as cool at the time. I wasn't the smartest kid in the class. Like, you know, I mean, I could hold my own, but there were some really smart kids in that class. So I ended up going from there to Stuyvesant. But honestly, I went to Stuyvesant kicking and screaming because nobody in my family knew Stuyvesant from Stevenson, quite frankly. And so we all took the test. This was the one thing that gifted program did. It made all of us take it. There was no questions. No, they signed us up. They told us show up at this place on this time. So I took the test, but I didn't know what I was taking the test for. They didn't give us any context, right? And so, you know, when we were approaching graduation, I wanted to go to the school where all of my friends were going, which was a school in Queens, by the way. And I told my 8th grade teacher, that's where I'm going. He was like, and then next thing I know, he had called my parents and he told them that, oh no, she needs to go to Stuyvesant. And my parents didn't know any better. So I came home that night and they were like, you need to go to Stuyvesant. I was like, why? They were like, because he said so. But that really did sort of, you know, it changed the trajectory of my life.
I wanted to interject really quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Access to that kind of social capital makes such a difference, especially I can imagine for immigrant families that don't necessarily have that much of a lay of the land. They don't know what has cachet, what doesn't.
Yeah.
And him just intervening and saying, listen,
Yep.
she needs to do this. This really means something. And then your parents being able to take that on and pass it on to you, it's really important.
Right. I mean, you know, that kind of like guidance, that kind of, you know, intervention, right, and rechanneling. Now, of course, I didn't appreciate it at the time because I got to Stuyvesant and that was the first time in my life that I realized we were poor.
Mm.
Right. And there was no support or guidance in that transition, right? For, like you said, right, for the immigrant families that, you know, don't have context and don't have anything. There was no like on-ramp, right, into that community. That being said, I know the difference that it made for me now.
So what gave you resilience to be able to survive that? Because I think there are a lot of, you know, people of color, a lot of immigrant families, a lot of Latinx families that, you know, sometimes you have the choice to stretch yourself, and stretching yourself, I wouldn't say being reject who you were, but going into this different space. Like, what gives you the resilience
I mean,
to
I
be
think
able to
at that
survive?
age, it's different. At that age, it was different than it is for me now, right? At that age, it was a combination of finding my tribe, and you know, this, you know, that what is it? Is it Beverly Daniels, Tatum? The Why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? Right.
Yeah.
So literally, right, finding my tribe and having that to ground me, and also you learn to code switch, right? That was the point in my life where I really sort of started to master that, not having the critical framework or the language to understand what was happening or what I was doing, but definitely developing that muscle, if you will. But you know, can we talk about the trade-offs with doing that? Because quite frankly, just to sort of jump forward, I didn't realize, so I started doing that in high school, right? And then, you know, you get older, you develop the critical analysis and the framework, and you start to get more woke and all that stuff. But it literally wasn't until about 3 years ago that I realized just how much that had made me, how much I was working to make myself small, to make other people comfortable so that I didn't stand out too much and that I wasn't too different.
So talk about what are some of the things that you felt like you needed to do to make people comfortable? And in particular, like, did you notice what were the things that made people uncomfortable in particular?
So it's about how you speak, right? Like the tones, the inflection, and the actual the actual language. And then there's about kind of, we do something when we talk amongst ourselves that's very direct, that's very clear. We are not soft pedaling. We are not making things pretty. Or like speaking in code, right? That's acceptable, that's palatable language, right? I literally had a board member say to me when I was talking about building programming for young people who were high school dropouts or pushouts, she literally said to me, well, can we focus on the little ones before they mess up? So let me tell you something. That was at the beginning of a job. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, I am here for a reason. I'm supposed to learn how to navigate this stuff and not be a bull in a china shop.
Yeah.
Right? Because what I wanted to say to that woman would have gotten me fired.
Yeah. Just really quickly on that though, it seems like the analysis is individuals make a decision to mess up. And so therefore, maybe try to go a little bit more upstream to get them while they're still innocent before they decide to mess up. And it seems like it's really ignorant or not recognizing how systems are designed to make sure that certain people mess up.
You're being really kind. You're being really kind.
So make it more plain. Make it more plain. Go right ahead.
Individuals. It's not individuals. It's Black folks.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's Black folks. Those people. It's those people, right? Can't we work with them before they mess up, right? So, it's inevitable. They're going to do that, right? If we don't intervene, because that's their trajectory. And
wow.
there is no question about who they are. I was working in the South Bronx. We're talking about Black and brown folks.
Yeah.
That was who we were serving. And so, my response to her, which I'm very proud of, my response to her was, you know what, I think we have the bandwidth to do both.
Amazing.
But don't, thank you. And also, that takes a toll on us.
Yeah.
There's a cost that there's a price that we pay as again, that's a perfect example of like, I was trying to make her feel comfortable, right? I wasn't calling her out. In some ways, I was making her feel comfortable because I wasn't calling out what she was saying and the implications behind it, which I just unpacked with you, right? Like so she gets to hold on to that and I get to do, what I wanted to do, right? Which is also why I talk about during those years, the extent to where forgiveness rather than permission.
Wow. That's such a powerful thing. Let's talk about that for one moment. So what does asking for forgiveness look like? What does asking for permission look like?
So, I wanted to do an organizing project. I wanted to work with young people from the community to help give them the tools and skills to organize and advocate and become activists around issues that they cared about, that they decided were important, whatever that might be. And it was kind of like the message I'd been told, was kind of like, that advocacy, that kind of stuff, that's not really in our lane. You should, we do direct service, right? So we're okay with being the Band-Aid, but we don't want to give them the tools to actually rise up and resist. And so I did it anyway. It was sort of like, oh, well, yeah, this community education thing is happening, right? Oh, you didn't want me to do it? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was what you meant. Well, we got funded for it, so I guess we're doing, right? So those kinds of things, right, where you start to deliberately and strategically, you learn to, identify the things that are going to be flags or that are going to be uncomfortable or they're going to be problematic, and then you begin to create an alternative route, which, by the way, is exactly what our communities have had to do for so many years to overcome the structural and systemic barriers that keep people where they are, oppressed and marginalized.
That is so powerful. So I want to, because we already gone into the professional, but I want to bridge. So you got into this very privileged school space.
Yeah.
I'm assuming immigrant parents would say, okay, abogada, doctora. Like you're gonna be like, médica. You're gonna be like a doctor, or you're gonna be a lawyer, so you can get that money. And so how did you end up picking a profession that was more grounded, I guess, in people and organizing and getting allies? See what I did there? As opposed to, going a different route.
So I was on the doctor route, by the way, that was it. But there was two things. I mean, one is that I was starting to, there was the sort of beginning of the awakening for me, right? Around like, there are fewer and fewer kids that look like me, and nobody here comes from my neighborhood, and like that kind of thing, and starting to question and look around like, why is that? And just all of that. And also like, I hated science. So like, I'm gonna become a doctor? Like, the idea was nice, but I wasn't enjoying the substance of it. I ended up by total sort of luck of the draw, spending my first summer after college working at a place in Rhinebeck, New York, a summer camp called, what is now called, some people might recognize it, Ramapo for Children, which back then was Ramapo Anchorage Camp. And I spent my first summer there after college, and there were kids that came from my zip code that looked like me, and they were being referred to as disturbed inner city kids, emotionally disturbed inner city kids. Right, so that sort of, it was an incredible experience for me in terms of my relationships with the kids and the sort of awakening that I had around my purpose. Right, that was when I realized that some of those kids were in my zip code, literally. That's when I started asking the question, or sort of feeling like there, but for the grace of something, could have gone I. Why them and not me? And that was sort of the beginning of feeling like something bigger than me was pulling me in a particular direction, and I was supposed to be of service in a different kind of way.
That's amazing. And before we go into the purpose part, and I want to hope that folks are starting to ask questions, start peppering the chat with questions. I'd love to open up the conversation. Just if you could just outline some of your like leadership roles in nonprofit and what you saw and kind of what you got a chance to do. And, we've already kind of given some of the lessons, like not make yourself small, and learning when you had to make yourself small, like what toll it took on you.
Right.
Also learning how to ask for forgiveness and not permission. Also, just if there's anything else as you went through your different roles.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, sort of there's a developmental aspect to some of those things, right? Because like some of that stuff is right at a certain point in your own kind of becoming process and in your own professional journey. Like, I'm not making myself small anymore. That's done. That time in my life is over. I'm also not asking for, forgiveness or, it's just not happening. I'm going to unabashedly and unapologetically kind of pursue what I think is right let the rest go where it might. So in terms of my career, there are a couple of different places I think that are that were pivotal. Ramapo ended up being pivotal for me. I worked there for 6 summers, and I just became the vice president of the board there. And my time there, I was there in '90, so it's totally
Wow.
funny. right? So that has been a pivotal part of my life. As a result of an offshoot of Ramapo, there was a group of us who had worked there who came together to form a national organization called Jumpstart. Jumpstart does early literacy and preschool programs. It also, the way they do that is by putting college students in the classrooms to do supplemental literacy work. And those college students are also being trained to become CDA certified. So it's a dual prong thing, right? The early childhood piece and also the increasing the teacher training pipeline. That was a critical experience because I, built the national infrastructure for an organization. I had no previous experience doing that. We helped write federal legislation so that work study students could participate in AmeriCorps programs. And then, also be for the education. Next other thing was I was the executive director of an organization here in the city called The Door. And The Door serves, young people. The way I used to describe it is young people who had been failed by multiple systems, education, ACS, court system, just multiple systems. And this is when I was in high school.
That is so incredible. That's
yeah.
Being able to give back to something that gave to you just creates like a whole different dynamic.
And being able to stand in front of young people who were coming there for services at what might have felt like some of the lowest points in their lives. Say, no, I was you. You that was, really important to me. And that speaks to representation, right? And then I do think that I spent the last decade in the South Bronx, heading up an anti-poverty organization and had a lot of different challenges there. But I know that I wouldn't be where I am were it not for those challenges, right? The aha moment of making myself small to help other people feel comfortable happened there. The idea of asking forgiveness instead of permission happened there, right? All of those things happen there. And so as much as some of that could have been, can be described as being painful, it's hard to, you can't separate that from who you become. And I am as sort of full and completely myself as I've ever been. And so I can't, I have to see that part of what that experience gave to me.
That's amazing. And one point I want to make, as I have a little bit of noise in the background. Oh, my daughter and dog came in. It's interesting too, because you're anti-poverty organization, you're doing some organizations that are doing great work, but even internally, politically, there's some challenges. And so sometimes folks who are supposed to be, who are on your side, I'm not going to call them horrible people, but put up barriers that are sometimes uncomfortable, and you have to navigate those relationships to get the work done. And I think that's a reality, and it's really powerful to know and understand like how to navigate it. And I would like to say that George Floyd's murder and the conversation we're having about race has kind of made a little bit more space to have really honest and open conversations with people who've been in the same room, but kind of talking past each other for a very long time to really have the real conversation about what's really going on.
Yeah. I mean, it's so, bittersweet is just not the right word. It's such an understatement. That when you think about like what had to happen to enable that conversation to finally start.
Yes.
Right? The human toll, literally. It's hard to not be driven by sort of anger at that, right? Because people, we've lost so many people. And at the same time, I am deeply grateful that we are, you know, that we, and when I say we, I mean people of color, you know, historically marginalized and oppressed communities are like rising up in a different way. I'm very grateful for the diverse coalition that has come up as a result of this, because I do think that's relatively unprecedented. You know, and we are living in what feels to me like a unique moment in time that has presented an opportunity for us to make a conscious decision about the way forward. And you know, the potential for us to build something new that does not replicate the structural and systemic barriers upon which our society is currently built, right? We do have the potential to say, no, we're not doing that. You know, if we've hit as rock bottom as they want us to believe, then what else have we got to lose? And why wouldn't we transform the structures of our city and our country in such a way that we are rebuilding with a focus and a lens that hones in on equity and justice for everybody, right? Wow. So that's where I am, and that's why I'm here, and that's what I'm doing. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
No, that's amazing. So I'm going to let Katie in, because Katie has some wonderful questions from our audience that hopefully she'll be able to let folks into the conversation.
Dianne, thank you so much for sharing all of your background and your perspective and kind of the way forward as well. We have some questions in the chat. So what I'm going to try to do is unmute those folks so that they can ask the question themselves. But because everyone is coming from a different tech background, I may end up asking the question for them. But the first question is coming from Nokululeko. So I'm going to unmute or ask to unmute. Hi, I think you're unmuted. Did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so it's Nokululeko and Nzinga here. I also registered. Thank you so much for this conversation and presentation. We were just curious to know if you could speak about your experience and understanding of the X in Latinx. That was a question. Thank you.
That's a good question, and it's actually one that I've been looking into a little bit. My initial reaction to that was, I am Latina, I've always been Latina. Latinos don't speak in Latinx, that's not our language. That being said, I also recognize that you know, the language is based in part patriarchy, and that, you know, there are you know, both in terms of the patriarchy and gender, all sorts of kind of reasons why we would adopt the Latinx word as opposed to Latino, Latina. I am very, the way I reconcile that, quite frankly, for myself is I am a Latina, and I am happy to acknowledge and recognize anyone who wants to be referred to by, you know, by using the Latinx. Happy to do that, but my choice for myself, as when I identify, is as an Afro-Latina or a Black Boricua, quite frankly. I have read also, you know, begun to read, because I'm really interested in the sort of origins of this, and I've heard sort of conflicting stories about where it comes from, but to the extent that it was actually created by sort of gender non-conforming Latinos from, you know, South and Central America, you know, I think there's a different level of validity than if it was imposed by sort of this other movement around sort of language and gender. I think there's something to be said for it, for what the root, literally, of the word and the sort of request to use that word comes from. So I want to be respectful of those who want to identify using the X, Latinx, and I would hope that they would extend me the same courtesy and respect when I choose to identify myself as a Latina. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And then our next question is coming from Carla. So Carla, I'm gonna ask to unmute you so you can ask.
Hi, I'm Carla. Thank you so much, Dianne, for sharing your history and your experience and advocating. I'm also a first-generation daughter of immigrants. My mom's Dominican, my dad's Ecuadorian. I went to a specialized high school, had no idea what it was, took that test blind and came out of there, you know, being like, oh, you're gonna go to Brooklyn now, 45 minutes on the train. So I definitely identified with that. My question for you is, how, especially now with, you know, now that we're in the wake of George Floyd's murder, how do you have conversations with your parents, with people of an older generation regarding race? Because for me, growing up, I always felt like there was this, you know, background colorism that was coming into play. You know, you go, you get your hair done, they'll say, oh, tú tienes el pelo malo, tú tienes el pelo bueno, or don't stay out too long in the sun. Little microaggressions like that, that now I look back and I'm thinking, that's bad, that's racist, why did we think that was okay? And then now talking about it with my parents, it's a little, you know, it's a little prickly, it's a little awkward, but again, I definitely want to, you know, have those conversations with them, have those conversations with my uncles, my aunts, my grandma. So I want to hear about, you know, what your experience is with that and any tips and advice you can give. Yeah.
Yeah. So I will tell you, it gets better, but it's hard. It's hard. So, and actually, it was probably maybe about, it was definitely in the last 2 months where something came up about el pelo and nariz, right? So I had pelo malo, which is bad hair for those of you who don't speak Spanish, and I had la nariz grande, the big nose, right? And it was literally just a couple of months ago that I said to my mom, no, you used to say this to me all the time when I was a kid, like, and she was kind of like, but there's nothing wrong with that. And it's like, oh my God, of course there is. Like, it's so stigmatizing. It's so, you know, whatever. I have had those conversations with my parents I'm 53, so it's been a while. I've been having those conversations with them for a while now. They now, you know, it's one of those things where, like, initially they completely used to dig in, and it was awful and fighting and whatever. But I think there's been something about, over time, right, they start to see things that actually connect to things that they've heard me say that they might have rejected. And so I think, you know, my parents now are actually living with me. They're in a much different place in terms of their receptivity to that than they were back then. What I would say is that, you know, there's something to the consistency of the banging of the drum, if you will, right? Calling them out, not letting anything slide. And you can do that in a loving way with family, like with your parents, not always with just any family, but like with your parents, right? You can do that in a loving way. And you can, you know, one of the other things I used to do at one point would be to shut them down. And like, I'm not having that. No, we're not, you know. And now I find what's really interesting is, like, now they'll ask me questions, right? And it's sort of like, I know that they have a thought or an idea or an opinion about that, but they're kind of checking with me to sort of figure out what's the right answer here, right? And that's true of, I think, you know, the phenotype stuff, right? I started having conversations with my parents just a couple years ago about my trips to Puerto Rico and the colorism there, right? And how with my family on the island, who many of whom were fair-skinned, with good hair, and or even in my experiences sort of traveling in places, I would often feel like I was the other, right? And not because I didn't have, you know, my hair is different. And so, you know, and that has changed for me, but I have sort of shared those things with them, and I feel like they hear it differently now. And it's hard to call your family out on stuff, especially like sometimes they'll laugh at you or reject you, or, you know, oh, you're so sensitive, you know, all of those things that are dismissive of your feelings. But they are listening, I think, and you know, just sticking with it if it's something that you really believe in, which I think, you know, you should. And being, you know, patient and loving, and also kind of drawing boundaries for yourself, because it is hard on us, those of us who are trying to educate. It does take its toll, and so self-care, I think, is also really important in those instances.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So our next question is coming from Johnny A. Johnny, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Awesome. So ask away.
Thank you. Hello, Dianne.
Hi, Johnny.
I like your beginnings. Is there a platform that you may know that would help me be identified as a Hispanic, not Latino or Latinx? Here's the issue. All of South America, and especially in this month, October, they celebrate the fact that a drunkard from Spain landed in their shores and raped all the women there. The Latin name came out of a little town somewhere in the middle of Italy. In South America, with the exception of 1 or 2 countries, there are no Italians over there for us to keep that name. So why do we keep on taking that name with us? Latin. The only ones that spoke Latin was the Catholic Church. But to the other person, our parents and our grandparents have been brainwashed and schooled in the Eurocentric approach. That's why our hair does not look pretty to them. They've been brainwashed. So how do I get out of this Latino or Latinx? As an adult, everybody that is around me while I was working or while at school, I would be very specific and they respected my wishes. Don't you ever call me a nigger. I don't appreciate that word. I'm here, I'm on my 60s, and I have a new terminology, Latins. I'm gonna feel the same way as in the past. Don't call me that. I'm a Hispanic. Do you have anything to say about that?
So I'll say to you what I said about the, the Latinx versus Latino thing. You have the right to, to identify however you choose. And I think that you can, that you can assert that and should own that and, claim it for yourself. The interesting thing is, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I can tell you sort of my understanding of it, of the distinctions. My understanding of the distinction is that people who refer to themselves as Latino speak a language that is derived from Latin, right? That is sort of the core kind of tenet of where that identity comes from, whereas folks who identify as Hispanic have descendants or are descendants from the Spaniards, right? So that's the sort of the overly simplified distinction between the two. Now, to your point, we are celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month. We're not celebrating Latino Heritage Month. So I think that's also to me, that's also an interesting kind of, there's a tension there, or a distinction there, whether deliberate or not, because what we celebrate this month is Hispanic heritage. And what's funny to me about that is that Latinos that I know celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, who might not just identify themselves as Hispanic. So I think it's a fair thing. It's an identity issue. And while there is the sort of academic origin of those words and those identities, I think that one of the things I'll say about Latinos or Hispanics is so many of us are an amalgamation of a lot of different identities. The Africans from the slave trade, the indigenous population, and the Spanish invaders, right? So there's a lot of that. And so I think that, that on some level gives us the freedom to kind of decide how we want to identify. And, I think that's your prerogative. If you want to be Hispano, then you should be Hispano. And that should, people should respect that. I didn't hear you, Johnny.
I just asked you to unmute, Johnny, just so you.
Muchas gracias.
Ay, de nada, de nada.
We have another question in the chat from Philip. Philip, let me find you. There we go. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you, Katie. I'm unmuted. Thank you for everyone here in the Citizens Committee. I really appreciate the conversation. Right now, it's really a learning opportunity, and I think identity is tied into so much of what we think about improving our communities. As a person who did also feel like was recruited into specialized high schools, I feel like, you know, that's a model that really, I felt like it took me away from my neighborhood, but it also promoted an idea that to uplift yourself and your community is to get away from it, and that you have to have a different set of skills, and like you're not good enough, and so you need to separate yourself and become better and not go back. And so I think that it's important to have these conversations about identity and how we envision our own contribution to improving communities and what we value. So I appreciate the conversation, even within that context. And I'm really grateful for Citizens Committee contributions to really help people access philanthropic resources to improve their communities as well. And so I'm just curious about Dianne or anybody else, or Rahsaan, what are some opportunities that out there for really transforming our vulnerable and oppressed communities beyond a charitable framework of, uplift? If anyone has like things that they've noticed or they think that would be important or necessary, I would love to hear. I'm always willing to hear about that. Thanks so much.
So Dianne, I'm definitely going to let you answer this from your standpoint. You know, how can communities rise up? And I'll let you, Philip, thanks for your question. I'll also let you know from my standpoint some of the things that we're thinking about. And that dovetails well into the last 10 minutes we're going to have of the conversation. We'll talk about some opportunities at Citizens Committee. But Dianne, I'll let you definitely go first.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So Philip, I have to just thank you so much for posing that question and for posing it in that way. I think there's a lot that was loaded. I think one of the things that brings to mind to me is the idea of the nonprofit industrialized complex. I don't know if folks have heard of that, right? One of the things I used to talk about all the time is that I felt like success in my work would mean that my work would no longer be necessary, right? So, if I'm serving community and trying to address gaps and deficiencies and that kind of stuff, the day that those things are addressed is the day that I was working for, as opposed to the idea I think that so many nonprofits take on, which is just the idea of self-perpetuating and continuing to exist in perpetuity. We really should be working towards what I consider the liberation of communities of color and low-income communities, and part of that is helping to build the tools, helping our community members to access the tools that they have and need in order to understand where the challenges and problems really come from, and to understand the levers that they need to be able to access in order to change that. And to me, that goes to this moment in time that we're living in, right? And the idea that I do feel like there's things that we could do if we could organize and strategize to push to overcome the systemic and structural barriers. But I think we need to be doing more than just sort of being the Band-Aid. I think we also need to be thinking about how we help people recognize the bigger matrix, if you will, that they exist in, and how power works to keep people where they are. We could spend an hour on just that conversation. So I feel like I dropped a lot there, but.
No, Dianne, thank you so much for that. I think that was excellent. I'll say a little bit more about what we are humbly trying to do at Citizens Committee. But we recognize that the grants that we give out are meaningful. What's more powerful is the network that we are. And if we connect someone who's organizing in Far Rockaway with someone who's connected someone to in Bed-Stuy, someone in the South Bronx, someone out in Staten Island, and that they all have similar concerns that are coming from a place of authenticity and not necessarily a place from recognized established power. And we give them an opportunity to be visible and to let their concerns be known and also their solutions be known on a larger platform to people who are leading institutions that are in City Hall, that folks are connected to like bigger industries and bigger institutions that are important for New York City. Then I think we're doing a service to the city. And I think also ultimately, this is kind of like a diversity and inclusion play. You know, you can get into groupthink or you can make a one size fits all solution, but literally lop off like a certain part of your population because you haven't really considered them. And so, and really to be inclusive and innovative and holistic, you try to shore up your blind spots. And we want to make sure that as solutions are being presented and as policies come forward for New York City, that we think about the least of these and we think of folks that might be off the beaten path and like how those decisions can affect them. And you create forums for conversation. You spotlight people. You give folks a chance for their narrative to see the light of day. You hopefully connect them to their elected officials and to other systems and institutions, and you allow folks to organize, and hopefully what they do rises to the top. And money can help facilitate some of that, but ultimately, I think it's the power of folks and people who influence the policies that regulate their lives and folks that are able to influence culture that are really going to make the difference. And hopefully, ultimately, that's what we can do by bringing people together, which is at the core of our mission. But there's another question, Katie?
Yes, I actually have, there's two more questions if we have time.
Yeah, let's do two more questions. Diane, if we're not overtaxing you here.
We got it. Let's do it.
Awesome.
So our first question is from Aya, so I'm going to ask them to unmute themselves.
Yes. Hi, Diane. Thank you for the work that you have done and committed. My question to you is, how do we bridge this Afro-Latino Hispanic to be one, to address our concerns in the community, to move things forward for the greater good of all?
Thanks, Aya, for that real easy question. I'm kidding. You know, so I think this is when we start getting into these, the word is escaping me, these tribal, that's the word, these tribal issues, these tribal conversations, that is where, you know, it makes me feel like we're playing right into their hands, right? That whole idea of divide and conquer, right? Because there's so many, if we were to come together based on our shared experiences, right? That would actually transcend, you know, Afro anything, Latino anything, Caribbean, because that would actually include the low-income white folks, because there's a lot more of them than there are of us, right? In terms of like, you know, you talk about the who's on public assistance or whatever, there's a lot more of them, right? And so it really sort of feeds into the master's narrative for us to continue to be at odds with one another or to be divisive or to be tribal in that way, rather than focus on and recognize that there is a very sort of elite and small few to whom, you know, that are advantaged, as long as like the cousins are fighting each other around, you know, whether it's identity issues or who gets a bigger piece of the pie, as if it was like, a, you know, as if like equity and equality is a finite thing that you can only have but so much of. So, you know, I think it's necessary for us to have that conversation amongst ourselves, and for us to do that educating and that organizing amongst ourselves, so that we can transcend those sort of barriers that have been imposed upon us, because that's a narrative that comes from outside, and we've internalized it and adopted it in such a way that it has us at each other, which is totally set up to keep us from uniting. To answer your question?
That does. And it's a very necessary conversation for us because it's so self-imposed, and such as yourself, myself, in terms of being out on the battlefield, so to speak.
Yeah.
Identifying, you know, I'm Cuban, Curacao, and my mother's from African America. And so, you know, I have the Latino on this side of the family and the Afro-American on this side. And it's always these struggles. And it's like, no, when they come, they're coming for us the same way.
That's right.
And so we have to be on one page and one chord. And I think that we have to destigmatize that conversation so that we can uplift our communities in the best way possible. So thank you for your work. May you continue to be out there and do what we do. And thank you, and thank you, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for these amazing questions. We have one more question, and then we'll close questions. So Dave, Daniels, your last question.
Hey, great, thank you. And thank you, Citizens Committee, for hosting this, and the panelists, Michelle, fantastic, learned a lot. Just reflecting on some of the comments and looking at, you know, the methods and procedures of, you know, those systems and persons that, you know, traditionally oppress communities of color. Wanted to get your thought on this idea of ownership, you know, the importance of teaching young people, adults, how do we begin to own the things that we create, the full spectrum of that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because we think it's important in terms of breaking the cycle, if you will.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I saw that. I did see that question, actually. Thank you for asking it. I mean, I think that's critical. I think that's really, really important. I think, you know, having it's true for young people. I think it's true for all of our communities, right? The idea of us being able to own, you know, businesses and own things. It is claiming a space that has been historically denied to us by narrative and in reality, right? The narrative sort of, it feeds into the idea that you don't own it because you're not worthy, because you can't, because you don't belong, because you're not capable, right? And we just have to undo and flip all of those things that have been so, you know, dominant for so long that, you know, again, it starts to become internalized. So I think it's really important for us to, from a really young age, teach and provide our young people with the access and opportunity to tap into their entrepreneurial and their creative and their ownership of things, ideas and art and all sorts of things that they get to really feel is of them, for them, and by them. That is a really, really, it's such an important part of identity formation, right? And self kind of fulfillment and you know, it is, and then that translates into community, right? Because if you feel like you are, you know, whole and fully formed, then it makes it so much more possible for you to extend a hand and support the growth and development of others, right? And to build community in that way. So I think it's critical. I think it's one of the key things that we should be thinking about. And it actually is one of the things that I think about for New York City moving forward in terms of how we come out of this crisis, right? And what that means in terms of what we need to be investing in and who we need to center in those investments. Communities, minority communities, you know, low-income communities, like the local mom and pops need to be centered in any kind of recovery for New York City, and they need to be first.
So this has been absolutely amazing. I wanted to make sure that we ended with purpose, in particular. What do you think the moment holds for the Latinx, Hispanic, however you want to identify community right now? You know, how do we, you know, how's the community go forward? And like, what are some of the opportunities and what are the things that you want people to know kind of almost in closing? So not to put too much pressure on these comments, but, you know, as we're in this Hispanic Heritage Month, as we think about identity, if we think about self-determination, what is the opportunity right now?
Yeah, I mean, so I will say, and I am by no means I should by no means be the final word on this. But here's what I'll say, right? To the idea that we are living at a moment of unprecedented crises and the intersection of multiple pandemics and, the brink of economic disaster and all of those things. The flip side of that is that we are also living at a moment of unprecedented opportunity. And let me tell you what I mean by that. And I feel a real sense of urgency around this because I think there's a window and we only get one in our lifetime. And once that window closes, we're sort of back to square one. I'll tell you this to switch it. In 2021, New York City will have an unprecedented number of elected positions that will turn over. Unprecedented in the history of the city since we adopted the charter, right? But by that I mean there's 35 city council seats that are coming up for re-election. There is the mayor, there are multiple borough presidents, there's the public advocate. Never in the history of New York City has that happened before. The idea that our communities could organize and push to create a shared agenda and a shared vision and actually elect people who would sign on to that agenda and the execution of that agenda is, the potential there is extraordinary. Extraordinary. But the amount of organizing and strategizing that's going to take for us to get that done is equally extraordinary, if not more so. But I'm pushing for that. I've been pushing for that in a lot of different conversations. The idea of, getting our communities, again, going back to what I said before, the system has not worked for us forever, right? Because it wasn't built for us, so it's not working for us. And so, it's understandable that a lot of folks in our communities just, want to sit it out. Although it's also true that a lot of folks in our communities show up, and I don't want to take that away. But if we all participated and owned our democratic right to participate, we could also drive the agenda moving forward, right? So, I'm spending a lot of time talking to, young people and, folks from the neighborhood. I live in Bed-Stuy who I don't vote. That doesn't matter. They don't care about me. They don't represent me. They've never done anything for me, right? Yes, yes, yes. That's all true. And also it's true that there is an opportunity here that we've never had before. Never, right? Even bigger than Barack, as much as I love Barack, right? This is bigger because this is local and this is a critical mass, right? Barack would have done much better if we also had a Senate for him. But this is, that equivalent. With the mayor and the city council, we could actually push to create change and bring people into government and leadership that really want to center our communities and partner with our communities in an unprecedented way. And so I think that, obviously that's not a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. There's a multi-pronged strategy we have to be thinking about here, right? So we could put people in office who we want to have in office, who are going to represent us. And we also have to stay on the ground and continue pushing, right? Because we can't let those people get into office and then get comfortable. Right, so we need that two-pronged strategy. We need all of us on the ground to continue pushing, but we also need to make sure that we're putting people in office who genuinely care and who are genuinely going to focus on our communities. That's my take right now.
That is an amazing way to honor Hispanic Heritage Month, like honoring people, because if we are civically engaged and we exercise our right to vote, to show up and to have a voice, then anything is possible for all people. And I think that's such a wonderful call to action as the census is wrapping up, and maybe wrapping up a little bit sooner than we wanted to because the Supreme Court decision that just came down. As voting happens, next month, and as we think about what's going to happen for, like you said, this unprecedented opportunity for new leadership in New York City, I think folks strategizing and showing up however they can is just going to be critically important. So this conversation, thankfully, was so rich that it went longer than we thought it would, but it was amazing for everyone to show up. So I'm not going to do a huge, long Citizens Committee for New York City commercial, but Katie put a link, as a Linktree link in the chat. She can also do it again so you see it so it's fresh. It has all the things we've been up to recently and what we're going to be up to soon. We're going to try to do these types of neighborhood chats every third Tuesday. It just so happened that the availability of Dianne and my availability was a little bit different. So we're gonna start a tradition of doing this the third Tuesday of every month, and might have some intermittent conversations. We have our CitizensNYC live, Facebook live events that happen usually at noon on Thursdays, usually like the second Thursday of each month. We are just really excited for you showing up. Those of you who want the intimate conversation about how do you get funding from Citizens Committee and what's going on, we're really going to use this space for that. So just know, as Katie said, reminded me before, if you know a neighborhood business that hasn't applied for a neighborhood business grant, they need to do so today. Our next round of grant making in general for local neighborhood level leaders will be in January. So for those of you who are looking for like when's the next time we're giving out money, it's going to be in January, and we will make sure that we have workshops that prepare folks on how to get their ideas together, in anticipation of the January timeframe. So be on the lookout for all of those great conversations. Dianne, mil gracias. You've been fantastic. We really loved this conversation. And just thank you for, making my first neighborhood chat just special. I'll never forget this. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for having me. And I just want to say that I hope you all recognize how special it is that Rahsaan is pulling this community together, and that you take advantage of it to continue to build. This is a part of the power building that we're talking about, and having the space to do this is a real privilege. So I hope you take advantage of it. Thank you, Rahsaan, for making this space.
All right, thank you. Everyone have a fantastic evening. Relax and let the stress be released.
Yay, thank you.
Buenas noches, gracias a todos.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.